a time period categorized by immense upheaval, both politically, technologically, and culturally. An era made possible by the combination of two simple metals, leading to greater tools, weapons, and implements of destruction and creation. An epoch that was absolutely defined by the rise and fall of immense and powerful civilizations. It's the Bronze Age, baby! Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Desks and Dorks. I am Kyle. I am the dork. A couple things. The YouTube pleasantries really do help us out immensely. If you are watching this video, there is a very limited window that you can back our Kickstarter. It is the exact best way to help us out right now. So if you want to support the work that we here at Desks and Dorks do, back the Kickstarter for A Fear Within. It is a rules-light horror role-playing game where one person plays as a child, the other as the very real monster that lives inside of them with powers based on that character's fears. It uses a simple relationship system. We are incredibly proud of the game. It is already fully funded, but we'd like to hit some of those stretch goals. So if you want to come and help us out and support us, it would mean the world to me. Without further ado, let's get to the Bronze Age. A few caveats. I'm outside of my bailiwick. Those of you who are brand new might not know this. I was trained as a medievalist, and so that means that I did a lot more research than usual in order to make this work and make this system absolutely possible. I'm going to be covering a pretty wide range of thoughts and topics. I am envisioning this as a Bronze Age buffet, not a really deep Michelin star dish. So if you're looking for deep dives on Bronze Age culture, probably not what you're going to find. Finally, on to the important stuff for Bronze Age, but first, a little caveat. Safety tools, probably going to be a useful thing for you if you are running a Bronze Age campaign and you want to lean into some of the more historically accurate stuff. In fact, a lot of the Bronze Age is defined by and determined by interscene political war and geopolitical conflict. This means that a lot of cities tend to get razed to the ground, and a lot of populaces tend to get removed from the timeline, if that makes any sense. So if you're going to lean into those darker topics, probably want to check in on your players and make sure they're doing okay. Just want to point that out. If you really want to lean into those things, please make sure that you're running safety tools. Check in on your players. But let's talk about things that are key to the Bronze Age. For those not familiar with the Bronze Age, I envision this as a primer on the things that make this period of human history unique and give you a sort of cultural understanding. I'm going to be painting with a relatively large brush here, but I really want you to get a feel for what was important, what would have been defining or key characteristics of cultural and political movements during the time, and then eventually we'll get into talk about how you can use those in your tabletop role-playing games. The first thing I really want to focus on is there is a massive focus on maritime endeavors, caravans, and trade during the Bronze Age. When we think of the Bronze Age, it's very easy for us to think of great city-states. We might imagine the Myceneans or the Minoans, for example, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or even the dynasties of ancient Egypt. However, this is true, but there is so much trade that goes on in the Bronze Age. It is absolutely staggering. It's easy for us to assume that ancient people would not have had access to some of the great fineries of this time period or have access to understanding and knowledge of what lay beyond the horizon. And while that might be true in some places, it was certainly not true in the cradle of the Bronze Age. In fact, this was one of the most comprehensive, well thought out, well planned, and well mapped out trade networks of all time, not just in ancient history or antiquity, but in all time. Archaeological dig sites have found numerous coins of numerous different kingdoms, city-states, towns, and well-fortified fortress establishments in places all around the world, thousands and thousands of miles away from where those coins would have been located. So it's really important that if you are going to be running a Bronze Age campaign, that you understand this is not just a isolated series of villages or even a few walled off and heavily fortified city-states. This is a vast geopolitical network that would have been held together by the mutual benefits of free trade and enterprise. It's really, really important. We've talked a little bit about all of those things in the Mediterranean, but one of the things that map that I used does not bring up, and I have yet to find a good map, so please, comment section, if you find one, please let me know. But those boats would have crossed the Mediterranean, but also navigable rivers as well. One of the things that comes up a ton, both in the primary sources and secondary sources that I looked at for this video, is the idea that river-based trade and river-based travel was both consistent, important, and incredibly lucrative. One of the things that comes up in my work as a medievalist is the knowledge that crucible steel, which would have been created in modern-day Iraq and Iran, was actually used by Viking soldiers during the Middle Ages, which is crazy and also leads to some of those rumors and stories about Vikings wielding magic blades. Kind of an important thing there to take note of. But river travel also plays a massive role in the Bronze Age. One of my favorite things as well as a medievalist is that we have evidence of Bronze Age traders in medieval Europe, which means that about 3,000 years ago, some of those Bronze Age traders from the Middle Ages, some of those Bronze Age traders would have made their way to Europe during its Bronze Age and engaged in trade there as well. Again, those findings are about 3,000 years old. I think it's a really cool concept because obviously when we think of the Bronze Ages, at least when I do, I think of the Mediterranean or modern day Middle East or even North Africa. However, the Bronze Age and its trade network extended pretty much worldwide, which I think is really cool. But this also included trade and land-based trade in between city-states. I think it's really important for us to make note that even during the times of like the pre-Roman times, that these Bronze Age city-states in what would become Europe in the modern era still engaged with trade with one another. Again, the trade of copper and tin, which were the most important resources during the Bronze Age, it's how you get bronze, would have been traded freely. But again, it's really important for us to take note that different geographic locations have different hard to get or hard to create goods that would be needed in other places. And so it's really important for us not to discount the importance of caravans, road systems, and land-based trade during the Bronze Ages. Now, this means that while it is possible you could get something and it might be really costly, it is possible. And that's a really big thing. I think in modern parlance, when we think about the works of or the lives of ancient people, we might think of them as incredibly simple, drab, or lacking in, essentials or excitement. But honestly, in the Bronze Age, that couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth. People had access to a greater range of goods, services, ideas, and concepts than ever before, and even your average person would have been familiar with, or at least would have heard stories of the wonders and incredible extravagances of far-off lands. And I bring up those far-off lands for a reason, because one of the things that can be difficult for us in the modern era as part of larger nation-states to consider is that countries and kingdoms did exist, but only kind of. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you there weren't countries or empires that had a vast and important impact on the Bronze Age and on world history in general. I often think of the Babylonians, or perhaps maybe if you're, again, a student of history, you might think of the Assyrians, or perhaps even of the Egyptians in North Africa. However, when we consider what a nation or a kingdom is today, it's very easy for us to assume that there is a strong national identity, right? I don't tell people that I am a Pennsylvanian, I tell people that I am an American, and that is something that is true, but it's something that we perhaps take for granted. A sense of national identity is a very modern concept. Even in Germany, for example, which did not have a national identity forged until the late 1800s, that would have been a very odd thing. You would have referred to yourself as Austrian or Prussian, for example. And this is echoed in the Bronze Age. Empires are widely unstable, even at their zenith, and they're dependent on a lot of cooperation with smaller local authorities and spheres of political influence, even within their own borders. It isn't as common to refer to yourself as a Babylonian, even if you are a citizen of the Babylonian Empire. It probably would have been far more likely that you would have been to refer to yourself as a citizen of whatever city-state, large village, or religious or ethnic group that you were a part of, rather than referring to yourself as a part of an empire in and of itself. This is important because I want to draw our attention to city-states. Now, this is a map of when city-states were sacked, but I actually liked this one, not because it shows their destruction, but because it shows us a lot of prominent cities and useful city-state areas during the Bronze Ages. These cities occupied not just geographic locations, but also important roles in the geopolitical systems that made up the Bronze Age. In fact, they had their own spheres of influence. Now, sometimes this influence was political, as officials and doctrines, laws that existed in a city-state might extend outside of the borders of its walls and out into the surrounding areas. It's also true that economically, this was a huge thing, as city-states could enact their own tariffs and taxes, but also their own protections to allow for the flow of free trade, and military as well. City-states would not have been uncommon, I should say, for city-states to maintain their own armies and fighting forces, or at the very least, a levy of sorts, a militia of sorts that could be called up into military service very, very quickly. We have a pretty good video on medieval cities and how they worked. If you watched that, or if you're curious about what a city would look like, that actually does a pretty good job. And a lot of the principles that are true for medieval cities are kind of true for these Bronze Age city-states. Again, it is possible for there to be empires, but the idea of a fully blown nation state with a national identity that has been sort of emblazoned into the spirits and minds and hearts of its people is a mostly modern creation. So it's very important for us to consider what the political landscape of the Bronze Age would look like, especially if you're running it in your own tabletop role-playing games. One of the poster children for this concept and for these city-states in general are the Myceneans. Now, I want to refer to this one. This is the ruins of a Mycenaean city. They would have been contemporaries of, and in many cases are precursors to, the ancient Greeks. I use this one, and you'll have to forgive the blurry JPEG image, but it is one of the best ones that I could find because it depicts the different parts of a Mycenaean city-state or city area that has not just a palace for central government located in its center, but also granaries to support its citizens, housing for those citizens, and points of ingress and egress for trade. But the reason I wanted to bring the Mycenaeans up is, as I mentioned, they are precursors and they are contemporaries for the Greeks. Now, when we think of the Bronze Ages, sometimes it is entirely possible for us to consider Greek city-states. Athens, for example, Thebes, for example, did exist during the Bronze Age in some way, shape, or form. However, their prominence during this time would have been not nearly as important. Remember, the idea of a nation state or a national identity has not fully coalesced, even now, and probably wouldn't coalesce until the modern era for Greece. But these cities, these city-states, would have sort of exerted not just their own sphere of influence around the surrounding area, but they would have exacted both tribute, politically and economically, from other smaller cities around them. These vassal city-states, or vassal cities, would have worked to provide not just economic support, but military support and the support of resources as well. The Mycenaeans are a fascinating example of this phenomenon in governance, and I think they do a great job with this map in particular. The reason I'm using this map in particular is because it shows that although these places, these city-states, do occupy a geographic area, a shared language, and in many cases several different and several important shared values, they don't have a shared sense of national identity. And that is a really, really big deal, both politically and culturally. But moving on from this, we have to really talk about that cultural aspect of it. There's a reason that I've sort of structured this way, because one of the most exciting things about the Bronze Ages, at least for me, is that the Bronze Ages are a multicultural melting pot, and that is entirely because of its focus on trade. As I mentioned before, you have sailors, traders, wanderers, merchants, and businessmen basically traveling up and down the ancient world to places that would be absolutely unknown to the people that would originally have lived there, but also traveling distances that actually would have been unheard of later on in history, even in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. So part of this is that as these people continue to move from port to port, from market to market, from trading stall to trading stall, what they do is they bring with them a spread of ideas and concepts. This results in an incredible blend of religious, cultural, economic, and philosophical ideas and concepts. It would have been entirely possible to learn about the deeds of somebody from Babylon, the religions dominating North Africa and the Egyptian cities, the important cultural and religious economic movements of the Mycenaeans and the city-states that shared the Greek and the Mediterranean peninsulas, all of those would have come together in this really interesting sort of cultural gumbo. And I think that's one of the most fascinating parts about playing in a Bronze Age setting, or in designing a Bronze Age setting at all. Remember, these trading cities, these trading hubs were not just there for the spread of wealth or the spread of trade goods. They're there for the spread of ideas, and that results in maybe not a more well-informed populace, but one that is at least far more aware of and intrigued by the goings-on of their neighbors than they would be in other ages and in other eras in human history. And I really want to bring up the Phoenicians, and I really want to talk about them because they deserve special mention. There's a reason that first map I showed you was a map of the Phoenicians' trade routes. As the Phoenicians spread their trade influence, they also spread their language, because they were such a dominant trade force that if you wanted to engage in trade, usually you would do so in some way with either the Phoenicians being the people you traded with, or the Phoenicians working as a go-between, a middle faction, as it were, in order to facilitate those economic transactions. And as a result, their language spread. Phoenician and the Phoenician alphabet has gone on to help characterize so many different modern languages, including our own, including English, which borrows some of our letters from the Phoenician alphabet, and indeed the etymology of some of our phrases from the Phoenician alphabet, which I think is absolutely crazy and wild to consider when we're talking about a civilization that exists literally thousands of years ago, but their trade network's biggest contribution to the modern era is the language. This is the kind of multicultural idea spreading that I'm talking about. But this was true as well, not just because of ideas, but because of the need for bronze. Not every place is able to produce tin and copper needed to make bronze, and as a result, you had to get creative about where you get it from and what you're willing to shell out in order to get that bronze. This means that as merchants, craftsmen, and smiths start to spread their ideas about bronze making and bronze crafting, they also are contributing to the spread of cultural, religious, philosophical, scientific, and economic ideas. One of those things that gets spread the most is deities and religious practices. If you've ever looked at the pantheon of deities in one culture and said, wow, that's really similar to the pantheon of deities in another culture, or wow, those religious rites seem very similar to other religious rites, you, my dear friend, would be exactly and totally correct. You see, as people continue to move across those borders in trade, not just their deities, but the ideas or the things that those deities represented would slowly seep their way into other cultures. Shockingly enough, we talked about that a little bit on our cults video here at Desks and Dorks, but it is something that I do think it bears mentioning when we're talking about the Bronze Age, and it's a perfect segue to talk about Bronze Age gods and the transactional relationship of faith that dominates this time period. You see, monotheism is a relatively new force in the world culture. Now, monotheistic religions, shout out to Judaism, have existed for thousands and thousands of years, but the popularity and prevalence of monotheistic faith is a relatively, again, modern thing. And so when we're talking about Bronze Age gods, the relationship that a worshiper has with a Bronze Age god is completely and totally different than the relationship that somebody in the modern era has with their own faith. And I think it is something that we need to talk about a lot in order for us to make compelling and historically faithful Bronze Age settings. One of the things that I want to talk about specifically is the interesting nature of Bronze Age deities as opposed to modern monotheistic faiths. You see, Bronze Age gods are not all encompassing, right? There is not just one god that sort of does everything. And in fact, one of the things that comes up a bunch are that in Bronze Age faiths, there are quite a lot of hyper-specific deities and divine beings that represent either, again, interesting certain things, ideas, or concepts, or were the patron protectors and divine sugar daddies, if you'll pardon the term, of these individuals, right? A god of ideas, a patron deity of scribes, like protector of mothers and those giving birth, lords of soldiers or masters of war. These concepts come up quite a bit, and it would not have been uncommon for a single household to worship multiple gods for multiple different things, or to switch their allegiances between one god or the other as the need arises. There is a transactional nature to the relationship that Bronze Age peoples had with their deities. As long as the deities kept coming in clutch, they would continue to receive worship, and if they stopped coming in clutch, well, the Bronze Age worshiper would go somewhere else. I think it's really important for us to talk about something that is very, very popular in popular culture even right now, and that is that in many cases, Bronze Age gods were very, very human. You see, there was no desire to put them on a pedestal. There was no need for the Bronze Age person to think of the god as omnipotent or omniscient, and in many cases, deities in the Bronze Age were neither of those things. They were, however, incredibly powerful, yes. They were, however, vastly important, but they were damaged and broken. In many cases, these Bronze Age deities were reflections of the people themselves. They're capable of great kindness and, of course, great power, but also of great cruelty. Nowhere is this more true than of the Greek or the Mycenean pantheon, which really did categorize their deities as the total and complete reflection of humanity, and as the not antithesis, but as the apotheosis of what power does when it is absolute, and it works with somebody who is flawed. These are individuals who, again, are reflections of their people. One of the most interesting readings I've heard of Zeus was the idea that, like, they were sort of railing against this concept that everyone hates Zeus now in the modern age. So, like, everyone expects Zeus to be a good husband and a good whatever, but in reality, Zeus is a reflection of what power does to a king who has no idea how to use it, right? Zeus is not this person for us to judge but within the modern lens, but a reflection of what happens when tyranny is given power. And I really like this idea that the gods are not just personifications of concepts, but that they are, and not just as human as we are, but ultimately that they are a human idea taken to its most logical and extreme. But ultimately, if you're going to take one thing away from this entire talk about Bronze Age worship and Bronze Age faith, it is this very simple concept. Benefits get you worship. There is no desire, no loyalty in many cases from the Bronze Age person to a particular god or deity if that particular god, deity, or faith is not getting them what they need. If you're going to put Bronze Age style religions into your game, this is very, very important for you to consider, because we have accounts in the Bronze Ages of priests and temples being destroyed because a god has, quote unquote, failed its populace, but also, more interestingly, at least for me, from an anthropological and historical standpoint, we have gods that slowly and gradually get replaced as leaders of their pantheon because they're not meeting those needs. Although not the Bronze Age, it was very early, before the Middle Ages, in fact, but Odin was not, in fact, the lead deity of the Norse pantheon. It was, in fact, Tyr, or Tyr, however you want to pronounce it, who was the Norse god of battle, and over time, that worship was replaced. During the time of Christian evangelization of the Vikings, Odin was starting to become replaced with Thor as the chief deity of the Norse pantheon. And so it's entirely possible, plausible, and in fact, I couldn't find any primary sources on it, but anecdotally it does make a little bit of sense that a deity could be replaced in a pantheon as the core or the most important if they are not providing that worship. There is a transactional nature to the relationship between a Bronze Age person and the deity or deities that they venerate, and I think that is critical for our games. But now we turn our attention away from the gods of the Bronze Age and to the battles of the Bronze Age. You see, regardless of where you are in the Bronze Age, there are a few things that we need to talk about. We talked to how the military and formations of fighting functioned. So let's talk a little bit about Bronze Age battles. A couple things that we need to talk about. Innovations. This includes weapons, armor, but also equipments and changes in administration, as well as tactics, how battles were fought and won, and how forces would organize. As before, this is a general primer into Bronze Age battles because depending on your culture, your geography, and your access to resources, armies fought very differently, but these are just some things to keep in mind during a general Bronze Age campaign. And the first one is that we have to actually talk a little bit about why bronze was so effective as an implement in military installations. You see, bronze is not just a shiny thing that is better than stone and rock. It does last longer than stone and rock, and obviously it holds an edge, making it far more effective for ranged weapons like arrows, as well as, allowing people to create things like axes or swords. But realistically, the biggest and most important thing about bronze is that it, as a material, is able to be used for complex and long-lasting shapes. You see, one of the issues that we tend to have, at least that I have seen anyway, in modern interpretations of the Bronze Age in popular culture, is that the Bronze Age generally gets short shrift. We think about it like, oh, they made some swords, they made a cool breastplate, right? If you watch Troy, with Brad Pitt, you can kind of see an idea of this, but realistically, bronze is far more than just a simple spearhead, right? This elaborate chariot, for example, is an example of what we could expect with bronze, and not only was it able to last longer, because again, this compared to a wooden or even a stone-ish chariot would probably not have been a very, very hard comparison, but not only is it longer lasting, more durable, more malleable, but you wouldn't have been able to get this complex of a shape. And this is especially true not just for the vehicles and the ways that they actually got around, but with the weapons and armor that Bronze Age combatants were able to bring to bear. I think Bronze Age armor is incredibly fascinating because this, by the way, is most likely what some of the soldiers fighting in the Trojan War would have looked like. It's not just a breastplate. These layers of concentric armor, this cone-shaped essentially battle tube that this person is in, this massive shield, this sword that is, bracing over part of the wrist and the palm. All of these are weapons that function only because bronze is able to hold a complex shape like this one for longer and still hold up under massive duress and during combat, right? This is a huge deal. This changed the field of battle, not just because, hey, I can make a better spear, this is awesome, but because think about it, you have an ability, an actual ability to last far longer and battle through blows that would have killed a man earlier on in war and in combat. It's really, really, really important for us to think about this because let's be real here. This is awesome. Also, I'm never not going to include something like this. I love Bronze Age armor like this one, and it's a shame we don't get more depictions of this in popular culture. Look how dope this is. Like, seriously, this dude looks like some sort of giant, tokusatsu villain. It's freaking awesome. But not only was armor like this incredibly protective and indicative of the importance of bronze during this era, but it's also an amazing status symbol. And yes, this is an excuse for me to include even more Mycenean armor that I think is absolutely amazing. But it was a sign not just of wealth and power, but of status as a warrior. In fact, the idea of a warrior king is kind of anachronistic. It's not something that would have happened in the Middle Ages nearly as much as it would have happened in the Bronze Age due to innovations that we'll talk about later about how armies and how military units were formed. Obviously, the Middle Ages does have some warrior kings, but if you're looking for something along the lines of epic adventure, you're far more likely to find it during the Bronze Age, at least in the research that I did, than you are in a time period that's similar to, Tolkien's Middle-earth, for example. We also need to talk a little bit about cavalry, because this is where I feel like a ton of people get the Bronze Age, and in fact, ancient combat in general, very, very, very wrong. You see, there's a couple different innovations that we need to talk about when we talk about Bronze Age combat, and this time I get to include a different type of Bronze Age armor. Look at this scale mail, which is absolutely fantastic. This is interesting because archers were actually one of the big primary uses of and beneficiaries of cavalry during the Bronze Age, particularly charioteers and chariot archers in general. It was a really big deal in tactics, particularly in the Middle East and in Egypt, where these chariots and charioteers were used to harass the enemy, to help break formations before a charge, or to help cover a tactical or fighting retreat. All of these were incredibly important and incredibly critical. Again, this is where bronze's complexity and ability to hold complex shapes comes in clutch. It is entirely possible for you to have heavy chariots and heavy charioteers that are more well-armed and more armored, but it's far less likely that those people are going to plow into battle, and far more likely that they'll use blades along the wheels to harass their enemies, or more than likely to use their superior speed and mobility versus infantry combined with the longer range of archers to harass and break positions and inflict casualties on the enemy in general. They're also very helpful for commanders to move around. Think about it like having access to an army in an RTS game. It's really hard for you to mobilize and use orders and make orders if you can't see what's going on in the battlefield. And a lot of the secondary sources and some of the primary sources that I looked at actually talked pretty in-depth about chariots and charioteers being used to transport field commanders in and around the field of battle. But now we need to talk about cavalry in general, and I've included this illustration of a Scythian archer because this horse actually in this illustration is incorrect. And there's some reasons for this that we want to talk about, because although this archer and the way that she's shooting her bow are correct, the horse is actually a little bit too big, a little bit too muscular, and a little bit too strong looking. You see, over time, horses were not used as cavalry because horses have had a longer evolutionary period than we think of, and during the Bronze Age they were actually a lot smaller and weaker than we give them credit for, or that I've seen represented in pop culture, at least represented correctly. It's why chariots were used. The use of the axle and multiple horses alongside with wheels allowed a weaker horse or a set of weaker horses to still move around and maneuver despite their heavy cargo. You are not going to get cavalry charges like the ones that we have in some popular media in the actual Bronze Age. It's just not going to happen because these horses are, again, far less powerful, far less strong, and far less able to bear riders. It's part of the reason that when you look at the accounts of ancient Scythia and the Scythian archers in general, the majority of those archers were women, because women in general weigh less and had less bone density, muscle density, less weight to bear down on those horses. It's why Scythia had a mainly female fighting warrior elite as part of the reason that they had those. Another big issue is that stirrups weren't invented until the 2nd century, right? And they would be in China, no less. So if you're going in and thinking about a cavalry area or a cavalry charge, unless you're starting at the very beginning of the period after the Bronze Age in China, you're not going to have access to those stirrups, which are key and critical for modern, or at least for medieval European cavalry movements, and the saddle wouldn't be invented until the tail end of the Bronze Age. So there's a lot of things at play here that are preventing cavalry from being used in traditional means and methods on the battlefield, and this is something that does not get talked about at all, at least not in the popular media that's reflective of this time period. And that sucks, because there are tons of interesting things that people in the Bronze Age did with cavalries, with horses, or with horse-like equivalents. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite unhinged Bronze Age cavalry-like innovations right now. Behold the Sumerian Donkey War Chariot. No, that is not a joke. Yes, this was a real thing. Essentially, the Sumerians would take big, thick wooden carts. They would take either long bronze spears like this one, or long bronze pole axes. They would get the most ticked off donkeys they could find, lash them to the front, and then literally like Tokyo drift on the side, and then just start spearing people. And either the spears would get them, the axes would get them, or in some cases, the donkeys, who would occasionally be armored as well, were just also capable of trampling and biting people to a state of unalivement. And that is just freaking amazing, because apparently if you just lash a bunch of ticked off donkeys onto a big, thick, armored wooden cart. You can use that to drive your enemies before you like a hot wind. It's awesome. I love the Sumerian donkey war cart. Please use this in your games, or at least look at some of the illustrations of this, because it is well and truly one of the most gloriously unhinged things I have ever seen, and I want more people to know about it. Moving on. But we also have to talk a little bit about military formation, organization, and tactics. I think that would go a great deal to expanding our use of and understanding of the Bronze Age as a force in our TTRPGs. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of the aristocracy, or at the very least, of the leadership of Bronze Age city-states, kingdoms, and nations, because I do think that's important. One of the things that has come up a lot in the research that I did was that many of these quote-unquote armies were closer to large war bands. And now, obviously, we did have some large armies, and there were a couple massive recorded conflicts in human history, but usually these were smaller forces that formed around aristocratic lines. So, again, this is going to depend wildly on the city-state, the quote-unquote nation or kingdom or culture that this comes from, but a lot of times, and in a lot of the research that I did, it shows up that these war bands would form around kings, nobles, members of some high-ranking person's inner circle, and so again, these function a lot like, weirdly enough, a medieval knight's retinue, where the most important people politically and economically would be well-armed and well-trained, and you would have people of lesser status, lesser wealth, lesser ability, who had some really good armor, some really good equipment, some really good training, and obviously as you would move down in social status and social strata, those things would change both in terms of training, ability, armor, and weapons. But again, it's really, really important for us to realize that although it's fun to imagine massive Bronze Age conflicts, and there were definitely some that absolutely happened, that a lot of times these organized among much smaller lines and around people of great political, economic, or social importance. Another thing too is that skirmishing tended to dominate quite a lot of Bronze Age warfare. It's actually one of the reasons that the phalanx and later the Roman maniple in terms of military formations were so important and were so critical in changing the way that warfare was done, because a lot of times Bronze Age warfare kind of, I don't want to pose it like this, but it sort of boiled down to military posturing. Usually skirmishers would line up, they would attempt to do a lot of different casualties to each other. Usually this would happen back and forth until one side decided they'd had enough and they would go home. You see, the reason I'm bringing this up and the reason it's very important is because, much like the Middle Ages, the main source of casualties is a rout. If one of those sides did decide that they had had enough, they wanted to go home, and they decided to cut tail and return to their city-state or their place of origin, if the other people had the ability to cut off their escape or some way to pursue them, whether that was through chariots or horseback riders, then you know what? What's going to happen is a massive military rout, and in those instances, what occurs is those warriors, those people, generally tend to die in droves. A tactical retreat, a military retreat, is versus an actual unorganized rout, is the difference between losing a battle and living to fight another day, or losing a battle and then your entire empire right afterwards. So something that's really important for us to talk about, and the reason that I actually brought up the importance of this sort of war bands and how they would organize around the military elite and the importance of those military elite, is they often formed a strong backbone for these armies so that they didn't collapse immediately into a rout. Whether we're talking about the heavily armed Mycenean aristocrats, the warrior rulers of Assyria, or, and I know this isn't Bronze Age necessarily, but the Triarii of Rome, those people, those forces, and the reason those warbands organized around them because of their heavy training, abilities, and uses are what helped to prevent routs from happening in the first place. It is really, really important for us to know that a pitched battle where a lot of sides fight to the death in this heroic display of honor and savagery doesn't happen. A lot of times, if there is going to be a devastating casualty problem, it's going to be because one side's morale broke and the enemy was able to pursue them, trap them, and end them. But now that we've established this aspect of Bronze Age warfare, we have to talk about the idea that equipment and training fell along largely economic lines. It's something that I've touched on through a couple times throughout this video, the idea that the more important you are in your socioeconomic status, the better equipped you would be when it came to fighting on the battlefield. Nowhere is this more true than in the Bronze Age. Even the Middle Ages, with its knights and armored warriors, armored nobility, it doesn't even come close in terms of the importance of and the impact that this socioeconomic status actually has. One of the things that is very, very clear, and one of the clear delineations of this is, of course, within that bronze armor. The Myceneans, I'm going to use again as an example, because that concentric bronze armor, those massive shields, those ornate helmets, the bronze battle axes, all of those things would have been a huge indicator, not just of your status as an individual, but your importance as a force on the battlefield. You wanted to keep these people alive, and during the Bronze Age, it was not expected, but it was far less uncommon than it would be later on in human history to see warriors as heads of state, and heads of state actually fighting alongside their actual compatriots in battle. And of course, armor was more than just a status symbol, it was a way of keeping these important individuals alive. That's not to say that other people weren't properly armed. Obviously, this is a great example of these. I love this one because it shows how the light and armored infantry in Assyria would work. But again, your heavily armed infantry and heavily armored infantry would have been individuals of what passes for a Bronze Age middle class. These would have been wealthy merchants or minorly important members of state, as opposed to individuals drafted or levied into these conflicts. It's important that when we are creating our own tabletop role-playing games, we are taking into account that importance off the battlefield usually leads to better equipment and training and positioning on the battlefield. And now we move to how to use the Bronze Age in our games. This is, of course, where I shout out Smokeseller, who has been doing some of the phenomenal channel art that you have seen in some of our recent videos. You actually got to see a peasant wizard in our folk magic video, and Smokeseller outdid themselves. They have made a number of awesome Bronze Age inspired fantasy TTRPG illustrations. The information, the links to them are in the description below, but this entire section is going to feature their art, and I'm very excited. So again, thank you Smokeseller for doing this. Without further ado, let's talk about how to use some of these concepts in our games. The first one that I wanted to lean into is the Widening Gyre. This, by the way, is a four-armed John Carter of Mars looking Bronze Age warrior that I absolutely love and adore, and I wanted to lean into the fact that a noble figure within the Bronze Age would have had access to not only fantastic armor, but great weapons as well. So this figure, this warrior elite, has a number of different features on the battlefield. You could use it and those dual shields to protect your archers or protect your ranged or magical combatants, and in doing so, anybody adjacent to the Widening Gyre actually gets a 20% chance to avoid ranged attacks. But again, that axe is going to give it double damage against adjacent foes, and that bronze spear will allow it to give people, or give itself, a little additional reach to reach out and touch somebody. And by that I mean nail them with the business end of a bronze pointed spear. Another one that I really want to talk about is our Storm of Arrows. This leans into the heavy inspiration of skirmishing, especially within ranged combat. You would essentially, in order to make use of this, use this as whatever ranged combat system you have in whatever TTRPG you're using. But to showcase that a lot of those Bronze Age conflicts and combats would boil down to essentially a skirmish where one side took enough casualties before deciding to just leave. Every third instance of damage against these arrow storms means that the people being hit are going to have to make some sort of save in order to actually avoid running away or cowering in terror before the ranged might. Another thing that I think is really important, and I actually want to talk about this not as a specific rule, but in the way that the Bronze Age temples would have been set up, is that sometimes, especially true in Assyria and Babylon, religious institutions sometimes functioned as military institutions as well. And so if you are going to be structuring Bronze Age elements within your game, this is going to be one of the things I would encourage you to do, is maybe make an area that is not only religious, but also functions as a military building as well. And again, this makes sense, right? Logistically, these religious buildings would have been stationed somewhere within a city at a point of prominence. They sometimes featured very thick, large walls, making them easily defensible, and because they were religiously important, the morale of those fighting to protect that location would have been particularly high. So again, not a specific rule, but something to keep in mind if you're going to put in some fantastic temples into your role-playing games. Plus, I just wanted to showcase this illustration in its full glory. I think it's relatively worth it. And lastly, my favorite rule is the God Merchant, because if we're talking about one thing entirely, it is the transactional nature of Bronze Age faithful with the deities they worshipped. And I loved the idea that there is a sect of priests that trade the favors of gods as currency. This means if you're setting a Bronze Age campaign, you can allow individuals to get paid in the favors of their gods. This means, for example, that let's say you do something for the priesthood of a god of serpents, and that god gives you immunity to minor poisons. Access to a god merchant like this one would allow you to swap that favor, swap that benefit, and exchange it on the god market for the benefit or favor of a different god. Say, being able to turn invisible 5 minutes per day. This is, again, my favorite of the variant rules that I have used. I've talked about using god favors as a type of currency before. This is an extrapolation of that concept, but this is, again, my favorite one of the things. If you're gonna do a Bronze Age campaign, please, just like Sabrina Carpenter, but please, do something like this. I think this would be absolutely fantastic. And with that, my friends, that brings us to the end of the Bronze Age video proper. And I get to shout out another artist, Reggie Mata, our fantastic illustrator for all of our games, did this. This is actually going to be our new convention banner, which is awesome. But if you like what we have done and you enjoy the stuff that we have made, the YouTube pleasantries go quite a long way. The QR code at the bottom will actually take you to our itch.io page, where you can get any of our games. If that is something that you would like, it is the best way to support us. But until next time, I am Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You've all been amazing. The Q&A section is next, but if you're only here for the rest of the formal video, then this is where we part ways. But as I've mentioned, you're amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, Dad Bod. How are we doing, guys? We made it to another video, and welcome back to the Q&A section. Again, if you would like to be part of the Q&A section, the link to the Discord is in the description below. This is unscripted, unedited. I am just reading off your questions and doing them. But as Salty Nick said, the shitposts have been summoned, which is very true. Ulfgar, SOS, _ 0571 asked, how was the density of the population during the Bronze Age, and how much territory could a city center of power effectively control? We touched on this a little bit in the video, but one of the things that I would like to say is it depends. Population density during the Bronze Age is actually quite high. There's some speculation that places like Babylon, for example, reached a modern level of population density. Like we're talking like of a modern city, or at least very close to it or akin to it. And in those cases, those cities of great prominence and importance could expect to control a larger area. However, this is going to depend and vary based on city and culture. This is true for the Greeks, who, depending on the city, only were able to extend that sphere of influence a certain amount. But again, it varies. Salty Nick asked, if I got transported into the middle of the Bronze Age, what technology would you invent first? Now, I think the safe answer is just gunpowder, because you have access to saltpeter in a lot of places in the world. But truthfully, I'm not entirely sure. I probably would go around trying to invent some form of lamellar, which is a layered Greek armor. The Aztecs did something very similar to it as well, but it was very light. Essentially, it was strips of fabric, then treated with salt water, and then occasionally reinforced with a leather core. But that was incredibly effective at stopping like Bronze Age arrows and javelins. So that would be potentially very useful for me to use. Some form of paper, like binding agent, which would have been great, tree sap or tree pulp, and then glue, because that would certainly be much more effective than the cuneiform stone tablets, although I guess it depends on where I wind up in the Bronze Age. And again, according to Salty Nick, I'm not allowed to bring technical manuals with me. But I think one of those things, actually, truthfully, the thing that I should probably do the most is just beer brewing, because brewing is the most important aspect of civilization at this time. It's why wheat is so important, barley is so important, and Although there were brew masters during the Bronze Age, there is a lack of understanding of the scientific processes that go into brewing, and I think an understanding of that would make me a very rich man. And also, the ability of brews to kill off microbial life forms within drink would have actually led to a lot of help for a lot of people, and I think that's really cool. Or boiling water actually would have been great too. There's so much stuff you could do. Carl from Carl Makes Stuff, where do you put the beginning and end of the Bronze Age? That's the first question. And the answer to that is, it's unclear. Now, how do I put this? I can tell you a general time period for the Bronze Age, but for the most part, historians are kind of divided on when it ends and when it doesn't. This is something that we have to talk about when we study history, but history is far more nuanced. It's not as simple as Bronze Age start here and Bronze Age end here. However, in most cases, most of the historians believe that it's anywhere from about around 3,300 BCE to about 1,200 BCE. That's a general time period. But again, a lot of the practices and cultural nuances that were common in the Bronze Age would have persisted long after it quote-unquote ended. The raw materials for bronze are scattered pretty far apart in most places. Carl mentioned that, hence the need of the trade network. Do we have any idea where/how people first figured it out? This one, I don't think we actually have a clear answer for. I do think that there are some civilizations and cultures that lay claim to being the first ones to do it, but to my knowledge, there is no definitive answer on who discovered or distilled the ability of bronze sculpting first. Did the jump from copper to metal open up any new possibilities? Yes, tons. We touched on them, but far more complex tools, weapons, armor, all of that is possible because of bronze as opposed to copper or tin or just like stone. And was the introduction of bronze something that changed lives fast? Or do we see long periods where it was restricted for, say, military use? The answer is it mostly changes them quickly. It's not like, or at least quickly in terms of how much a cultural or technological development would impact and affect human development. So, like, it's not like the elite restricted the use of bronze. Once people were aware of how useful bronze was, and obviously things were a little bit different and difficult for, say, like a secular or political or economic power to try to restrict the use of an individual resource like bronze, but it was something that hit really hard and then made something absolutely massive. So yeah. Ulfgar asked, what was the level of technological distribution during the Bronze Age? I think it was, I don't want to say mostly even, but it wasn't like bronze was only known in one section of the world. It was pretty widely distributed. And what was the reason for it? Trade. That's literally it. It's just trade. The Bronze Age trade network comes in clutch over and over and over and over and over again. It is really hard to overstate the importance of that trade network and its impact on Bronze Age development culturally, politically, economically, technologically. It's impossible for us to talk about that. Cool person, what was the mythology behind bronze and copper? This is a really interesting question because some cultures did seem to hold certain metals in sacred. And here's the thing, I don't know necessarily if bronze itself was held sacred, and I think part of that is because of its practical uses, but I do know that bronze, because it was both practically important and expensive and time-consuming to make, it was an important resource, I do know that it was used often for idols and things of religious nature, right? That does come up, right? Because it would have been a sacrifice to your god to sacrifice bronze that could have been usable for everything from weapons and armor to jewels, ornamentation, farm implements, whatever. It would have been a huge sacrifice monetarily, and also an opportunity cost. You're losing out on the ability to use that bronze for other stuff. So there is a huge bleed over of using bronze as an important sacrifice, which I think is a thing too. So Ignacio says, I assume the knowledge of bronze metallurgy spread in some friendly and in some not so friendly ways. How could we tap into that tension? For a TTRPG story. Ignacio, man, this is why I love when you chip into these comments, because that's such a great question. So if you were going to use this as part of your TTRPG campaign, I freaking love this question. The thing that I would choose to do is, if you set your game into an early Proto-Bronze Age, you could have the construction of bronze be a secret that is held by an empire, a ruler, a political faction, a city-state, whatever, and you could have your player's entire adventure be getting the secret of that metallurgy from that faction. If you wanted to make it more widespread, you could just make it so that a singular faction has maybe access to a smith that knows how to use the bronze and work the bronze in a far more effective way than the smiths of other individuals that you're working with. I think that's a great way to approach it and how I would intend to use it. Another, shall we say, like media franchise, media property is a wonderful game called Tyranny. And if you were really going to lean into it, Ignacio, I think Tyranny does it well. Part of the reason that Tyranny is so cool is you're playing as the bad guys. And one of the reasons the bad guys are so effective in literally just like nuking the good guys from orbit is because they are in the Bronze Age when the other people aren't. Or they're in the Iron Age when the Bronze Age is ending. So you could theoretically have your game take place during the transition from stone to bronze. And so, you know, depending on who is the one using the bronze, controlling the bronze, that would be a huge impact and a huge change on that setting. I think that's a great way to do it. Cadme asked, how different was Bronze Age society and politics from the stories written by classical period authors that are set during the Bronze Age? And how well do they preserve details of life from that previous age? Is there anything that gets seriously wrong? E.g. Greek Bronze Age stories versus stories of the heroic age / late Egyptian Ptolemaic stories about the old Middle Kingdoms. This is a really loaded question because it's one that I think probably deserves its own video, Cadme, which is why I don't want to do too much with it. I know that sounds like a cop-out answer, but in truth, right, how different was Bronze Age society from the stories written essentially by those people about themselves? The answer to that question is pretty simple. It depends on the story, right? We know that ancient historians tended to embellish, particularly in cultures like the Greeks, where it was not just expected, but kind of encouraged that you would hype yourself up in some way, shape, or form. But that means that a lot of times we have to take those stories with a grain of salt. This is similarly true, I think, for a lot of cultures, even for us in the US. The stories, the cultural nuances, the things that we talk about, these are things that in a lot of ways, like, we try to paint ourselves the way that we would like to be seen by future generations, or we create those stories in a way to highlight values and things that we think are important. So I would be hard pressed to treat a lot of the stories that these cultures wrote about themselves with any degree of seriousness if you're looking at them as a scholarly source. Now, you can still look at those stories as an important source of information, because what you can do is look at them and you can glean how these individuals wanted to be seen by future generations and how they wanted to be interpreted by future generations. And I think that's valuable as well. The Ptolemaics, of course, by the way, are an interesting exception to this. There are ancient Greek archaeologists. Like, Egypt is such a long-reaching empire that we have ancient Egyptian archaeologists who were studying Egyptians that are more ancient than they are. So if you were able to gain access to their accounts, their findings, that I think would be a little bit more interesting as well. Yes, in the Bronze Age, was it seen as respectable to come in third place? I freaking cannot, dude. You know what? Yes, I imagine it's like that Papa John's meme of the dude popping champagne and kissing the lady on the podium and biting the medal, and he's in last place. I like to think that that's how they would do that. God bless America. That is a freaking great question. Yes, I owe you, I don't know, a crisp high five or something. Ulfgar asked, how fast did iron spread during the later part of the Bronze Age? Fast. How effective were the weapons and armor? And what were they? We talked about that a lot. The armor and weapons of the Bronze Age, incredibly effective, very useful. Regarding animals, I know lions lived in Greece during a lot of the ancient era. There are other similar cases of animals that are extinct. Not now, but they were alive during the Bronze Age. Or how many, not locally, but how were they alive during the Bronze Age? And the truth of the matter is, we don't know necessarily, Ulfgar. Humanity has, for as long as we've been around, we are really good at exterminating things. And so kind of important that we it's hard to tell, right? Like, the Nemean lion is a great example of this. The legend of Heracles fighting the Nemean lion. It might have easily been inspired by the real Greek lions that were around, but without actual physical evidence of those animals, it's hard to know when and how they went extinct, how many of them, and where they were at. Just knowing human beings, I know for a fact that we are really good at exterminating stuff and making things go extinct. So Who knows? Apprentice salesman. Eventually apprentice salesman. I hope you will become a master salesman. If, as a part of being a citizen in a pre-modern society, you had to own and maintain a suit of armor to be used in times of war, if conscripted, would you choose bronze or steel or iron? This depends entirely on when you live. But mostly you would just choose whatever the best material is available to you. So that, like, again, if you're in the Bronze Age and you have the ability to afford the bronze armor like the Myceneans had, you would have bought it. If it's during the Iron Age, you're buying the iron weapons. You're not going to buy bronze. Again, same thing with steel. But I think the more interesting part of your question, apprentice salesman, is would you like the maintenance of it? Because depending on when and where you lived, you were responsible in a lot of civilizations for the maintenance of your armor, and there were civic economic penalties that came with not maintaining your equipment really effectively. So that is a cool angle, I think, for a tabletop RPG. So cool. Masked Bandit. I have no idea what's going on, but I'm stoked for this. Hey, thanks, Masked Bandit. Glad to have you aboard. Inspired by Minoan events, which is cool. How the story of King Minos is... Oh yeah, you're just talking about how cool King Minos was in the Minoans. In general, their murals worshipped queens and octopi for some reason. Yeah, that's true. By the way, Masked Bandit, a lot of, I think, not like Eldritch mythology, like Chthonian mythology, is actually kind of taken from some Greek civilizations, which is cool. Ixtith the Unlucky, love having Ixtith around. RE the mythology about bronze. Do note that the idea of Demeter putting a child she was nursing in the fire in the Elysian circles to purify it is inherently related to the idea of smelting Ixtith. I love having you around. Thank you so much, because I didn't know that was a thing, because the ancient cult of Demeter was not something that I studied. So shout out to Ixtith, who is a religious historian, by the way. Awesome individual. Masked Bandit. Are there any examples of people traveling from the Mediterranean to Afghanistan to make bronze? The next nearest tin deposit records. I mean, would make for an awesome real life quest. And the answer to this, Masked Bandit, is yes. In fact, there were multiple individuals that made actually far-reaching trips to places like Iraq, Afghanistan, or the Indus Valley in India, and we actually know this because we found coins from empires in those regions in places like Sumer, which is freaking nuts. But yes, it would make an epic quest, and in fact, epic questing is a commonality of the Bronze Age. If you're going to set a time, I forget who mentioned this in one of the comment sections, but somebody said, hey, the Bronze Age is pretty much ripe for all of the classic adventure tropes that we think about in D&D, and it's 100% right. You have no idea what's out there in a lot of the cases. You have tons of interesting political conflict and military strife. You have heavily armed adventurers doing missions for the highest bidder. You have new technological institutions. You have magical and religious institutions. Like, yeah, the Bronze Age basically is just what D&D wants to be, just in general. Cavalry asked, how did the Bronze Age differ across regions? Did they occupy the same span of years, or was there some significant separation? There is a little bit of separation, I think, as the technology develops. Again, we're not entirely sure where or when bronze smithing starts and who does it first. We know the general region, but it turns out that I don't want to say they're all similar, because a lot of it plays out in terms of geography and cultural values, but in the use of the technology, it was basically like when you get it, you wanted more of it, and you were either going to make, trade, or take it for yourself. Alien Dragon XLII said, it makes me think how technically the South American Bronze Age lasted up to the Spanish conquest. This is true, actually. If you were going to be isolated from world events in some way, shape, or form, then yeah, your Bronze Age would have technically lasted far longer than others. But again, I'm trying to make this as general as possible. Not a huge difference, I don't think. Well, man, that's not true. There are differences. Everybody wanted bronze. Everyone's gonna use bronze. That's how I'm gonna say it. Basically, Spike'em59 said, in a world heavy in magic never switched out bronze for iron as the primary metal, how might it develop? Let's say that iron has magical dampening properties, as it does in many lores, and isn't so good for enchanting. What might that world look like as they advance down that theoretical tech tree? For me, it becomes a question of two different delineations, right? If we're not using iron because it is magically dampening, then that means that the society feels magically inclined, right? That magic becomes the really exciting and important thing for the society writ large, right? So that means that if we're going to be going down this tech tree, bronze is being used because it is magically boosting, or allows wearers to both use magic or use the metal and the weapons as well, in addition to spells. So I think that's kind of what that theoretical tech tree looks like, right? You have like essentially Bronze Age mage knights, which I think would be really, really badass actually. But this also opens up the idea, again, using your terminology, that if iron is magically dampening, that means that there's probably a class of people or a specialized soldier who uses mostly iron to hunt down and end magic users. So what you could have is eventually a class war, or a I don't know, social stratification war between bronze wielding magic users and iron wielding non-magical soldiers and combatants. I think that would make for a really, really interesting TTRPG setting. Spikeum59, I think that's a really cool call. Salty Nick asked, what is the best untapped potential Bronze Age for tabletop RPGs? I'm going to give you a couple recommendations. I think one, Conan the Barbarian is still probably just such a great inspiration for Bronze Age RPGs, or even early Bronze Age, late Stone Age RPGs, and to the point that it's crazy to see the DNA of Conan in like so many of the different stories and things that exist. I will again give Tyranny a shout out. I think that game is underutilized and underappreciated for what it was, and I am dying for a sequel. Give me more Tyranny. Come on. And of course, I'm going to give a shout out to an old TTRPG called The Red Gods of Babylon that was released for free and then basically just sort of disappeared. I thought that game was really cool. In terms of like a specific part of the Bronze Age, Salty Nick, that I think would make for a good RPG, it is the relationship between humans and the divine. I think that is the most exciting aspect of that era, at least for me. And then Mass Bandit said, what in metallurgy, glasswork, etc. did people consider literal magic or have cool supernatural explanations for? And that's interesting, and I think it varies from culture to culture. Some cultures did have a pretty great understanding, maybe not necessarily of the science behind it exactly, but knew that glasswork, metalwork, bronzework, whatever, were in fact useful skills to have, and not magical aspects or magical thing. Either way, I think it's really interesting to consider, because there were some cultures who did believe, like in some way, shape, or form, that those were magical processes. The one thing that came up, and I know I'm not talking about specifics because I couldn't find a lot on specifics for this question, but I will say the one thing that came up was that metalwork and metallurgy in general, these crafts, even if they themselves were not seen as magical necessarily, they were seen as gifts from the gods to be appreciated, cherished, and used both in their glory and in the service to their ends, which I think is pretty neat. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of the Q&A section. I know it was a long Q&A. I'm going to just make a small, short announcement right here. So this coming new year, because I'm finally over my 8-week viral cough, sickness, garbage, whatever, we're really going to be stepping up the content. So you are going to be getting more videos of this quality like this year. We're going to be doing way more historical content. We're hoping to bring you some live plays, some actual plays, and some really cool stuff coming up. This is January is the slow month, but we are going to really, really, really kick it into overdrive from here on out. So I'm really excited. It's going to be a big year for Desks and Dorks, and I hopefully have encouraged you all to stick along for the ride. With that being said, I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. Thank you all for your insightful questions. You're absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.